The guitar stopped. Bob Dylan lowered it to his side. He looked at a man in the front row. That look changed everything. The concert never continued the same way. Philadelphia. November 1978. The Tower Theater. 2,000 people packed into the old venue on 69th Street. Bob Dylan was 2 songs into his set, acoustic, stripped down, just him and the guitar and that voice that had defined a generation whether he wanted it to or not. He was playing Forever Young, the 3rd verse. His fingers moving across the strings with that loose, almost careless precision he'd perfected over 20 years of performing. The audience was silent in the way audiences are silent when something matters, not dead silence, but breathing silence, listening silence. And then he saw the face. Front row. 7 seats from center. A man in his late 60s. Gray hair. Worn jacket. Hands folded in his lap. Just sitting there. Looking up at Dylan with an expression that wasn't quite recognition, but wasn't quite anything else either. Dylan's fingers stopped moving. The chord hung in the air, incomplete. The guitar went quiet. He lowered the instrument slowly until it hung at his side, held loosely in his left hand. His entire body turned slightly toward the front row. Toward that one seat. That one face. The silence spread like a stain. 2,000 people suddenly aware that something was wrong. Or not wrong. Different. The music had stopped, but Dylan hadn't moved to adjust a string or clear his throat, or do any of the small things performers do when they pause. He just stood there. Looking. The man in the front row didn't move either. He held Dylan's gaze. And in that moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with music or performance, or the weight of being Bob Dylan. The sound engineer in the booth reached for the fader, thinking there was a technical problem. The tour manager stood up in the wings, confused. The audience shifted in their seats, uncertain. Dylan still didn't move. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. To understand what happened in that theater, you need to understand what happened in a classroom 23 years earlier. 1955. Hibbing High School. Northern Minnesota. Iron Range country where the mines went deep and winter went deeper. Bob Zimmerman. Not Dylan yet, just Bobby, the weird kid who played guitar and wrote poetry nobody understood, was failing English literature. Not because he couldn't read. He read everything. But he couldn't make himself care about the assignments, about the analysis, about breaking down Steinbeck and Hemingway into neat little essays that fit the rubric. His teacher was a man named Warren Aldrich. 52 years old. Veteran of the Pacific Theater. Taught English for 27 years in the same classroom with the same desk and the same exhaustion in his eyes. Most teachers had given up on Bobby Zimmerman. The kid was smart but impossible. Distracted. Difficult. More interested in his guitar than his grade point average. But Warren Aldrich saw something else. Not talent. Plenty of kids had talent. Something harder to name. A kind of restlessness that didn't come from rebellion but from needing to say something the world didn't have words for yet. One afternoon in March, Warren kept Bobby after class. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. Bobby stayed standing. "I've got." "Sit." Warren's voice had that particular authority of men who'd seen worse things than difficult students. Bobby sat. Warren pulled out Bobby's latest essay. A-. Red ink everywhere. "This is terrible," he said flatly. "I know." "No, you don't know. It's terrible because you're trying to write what you think I want to hear instead of what you actually think. And what you actually think is the only thing worth reading." Bobby looked up at him, surprised. Warren leaned back in his chair. "I was in the war. Pacific. Saw boys your age die in ways I won't describe. You know what I learned? Life's too short to spend it pretending to be someone else. Even if the someone else gets better grades." He pushed the essay back across the desk. "I'm giving you a choice. You can rewrite this the way you were taught, get your C, move on. Or you can write me something true. Something that matters to you. Even if it's not what English literature says it should be. And if it's still terrible? Then at least it'll be honest. Bobby rewrote the essay. Not about Hemingway. About the iron mines. About men going into the ground and not coming back the same. About his father's appliance store and the quiet desperation of small-town commerce. About the folk songs he was starting to learn and how they seemed to carry something he couldn't find in books. Warren gave him a B. Not because it was technically proficient, but because it was real. That was their only significant interaction. Bobby graduated 2 months later. Changed his name. Left for New York. Became Bob Dylan. Became the voice of a generation. Became everything Warren Aldrich had seen stirring in that restless kid who couldn't write a proper essay but could write the truth. Warren never mentioned it. Never wrote Dylan a letter. Never showed up at concerts or tried to claim any connection. He just kept teaching English literature in Hibbing, Minnesota, watching winter come and go, occasionally wondering what had happened to Bobby Zimmerman. In 1972, Warren's wife died. Cancer. 3 months from diagnosis to grave. He retired 6 months later, sold the house, and moved to Philadelphia to be near his daughter. He didn't follow Dylan's career. Didn't own the albums. Wasn't even sure what the kid looked like now. Probably had long hair and wore strange clothes like all the protest singers. But his daughter had gotten him a ticket to the Tower Theater show. Dylan's playing, she'd said. Remember that student you always talked about? Bobby Zimmerman from Hibbing? This is him now. He's famous. Warren had shrugged. He was going to be something. Didn't know what. The ticket was front row. 7th seat from center. Warren had arrived early, sat down, and waited with the patience of a man who'd spent 30 years waiting for teenagers to settle down and pay attention. When Dylan walked on stage, Warren had felt a small shock of recognition. That was Bobby. Older, weathered, but the same restless energy underneath. The same need to say something true. And then Dylan started playing. Forever Young. 3rd verse. The line about staying forever young. Warren had looked up at the stage. And Dylan had looked down. And in that moment, both of them saw exactly who the other person was. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. The Tower Theater was completely silent. Dylan stood center stage, guitar hanging at his side, staring at the man in the front row. Warren Aldrich sat perfectly still, hands folded, looking back. Someone in the audience coughed. Someone else whispered something. The sound engineer's fingers hovered over the board, uncertain whether to cut the lights or just wait. Dylan's tour manager, Frank, stepped out from the wings. "Bob?" he said quietly, not quite loud enough for the audience to hear. "You okay, man?" Dylan didn't respond. He was still looking at Warren. And then, slowly, deliberately, Dylan lifted the guitar back up. Not to the playing position, but across his body, both hands gripping the neck, holding it like you'd hold something precious you were about to give away. He walked to the edge of the stage. The front row collectively leaned back, uncertain what was happening. But Warren didn't move. He just watched Dylan approach. Dylan knelt down at the stage edge. Something he never did. This wasn't that kind of show, he wasn't that kind of performer, and looked directly at Warren. "You told me to write something true," Dylan said. His voice was quiet, but the theater's acoustics carried it everywhere. 2,000 people heard every word. "I've been trying for 23 years. Warren's eyes filled with tears. He nodded once. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I've heard." Dylan smiled, that rare, genuine smile that had nothing to do with cameras or image or the weight of being Bob Dylan. "Did I get it right?" "Some of it," Warren said. And then, after a pause, "The parts that mattered." Dylan laughed. A short, surprised laugh that sounded more like relief than humor. He stood up, backing away from the stage edge, and looked at the guitar in his hands. "I was going to finish that song," Dylan said, speaking to Warren but loud enough for everyone to hear. But I don't think I need to now. He turned back to his mic stand, carefully leaned the guitar against it, and pulled out his harmonica instead. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. He didn't finish Forever Young. He never played it that way again. Instead, he played a song he'd written years ago but rarely performed. Tomorrow is a long time. Slow. Aching. A song about distance and time and the things you carry with you. The audience didn't understand what had just happened. Most of them didn't know who the man in the front row was or what Dylan had seen in him. But they felt the shift. The weight of something significant having occurred. Warren sat through the rest of the concert with tears running down his face. Not from sadness. From witnessing what happens when you tell a kid to write something true and then, 23 years later, you discover they actually did it. After the show, Dylan's tour manager found Warren outside the theater. "Mr. Aldrich? Bob wants to know if you'll come backstage." Warren shook his head. "Tell him no. Tell him it was good to see him. Tell him to keep writing what's true." Frank started to protest, but Warren was already walking away, hands in his pockets, disappearing into the Philadelphia night. Dylan was sitting alone in his dressing room when Frank delivered the message. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That sounds right." From his guitar case, Dylan pulled out a battered notebook, the kind he'd carried since he was a teenager. He wrote something on a blank page, tore it out carefully, and handed it to Frank. "Get this to him," Dylan said. "His daughter's name is Margaret. She lives in Philadelphia. Find her. Give this to her. Tell her to give it to her father." Frank looked at the paper. It wasn't a letter. Just a few words scrawled in Dylan's handwriting. "You gave me a B. That was generous. The truth is still terrible sometimes. But at least it's honest. Thank you, Bobby." What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. The concert review in the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned the strange pause during Forever Young, but didn't understand it. Dylan seemed distracted mid-performance, the critic wrote, though he recovered with a haunting rendition of Tomorrow is a Long Time. Warren Aldrich died in 1983, 5 years after that concert. His daughter Margaret found Dylan's note tucked into her father's copy of East of Eden, the Steinbeck novel he'd taught for 30 years. She called Dylan's management. Left a message. "My father kept your note next to his favorite book. I thought you should know. He said you were the best student he ever had, even when you were failing." Dylan was on tour in Europe when he got the message. He sat in his hotel room in Amsterdam, staring at nothing, remembering a classroom in Hibbing and a man who told him life was too short to pretend to be someone else. That night's show, he played Forever Young, for the first time since Philadelphia. He didn't finish it. He stopped at the third verse, the same place he'd stopped 5 years earlier, and let the silence sit. The audience waited, confused. Dylan looked out at the crowd. "Sometimes you meet people who see who you really are," he said quietly, "before you see it yourself. This one's for those people." And then he played Tomorrow is a Long Time instead. He's done it that way ever since. Forever Young, leading into silence, then Tomorrow is a Long Time. Musicians who play with him know not to ask why. Critics have analyzed it for decades. Fans have theories. But the truth is simpler, and harder, and more human than legend. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Bob Dylan is 82 now. Still touring. Still writing. Still trying to write something true. In his guitar case, underneath the harmonicas and spare strings, he carries the essay he wrote in Warren Aldrich's class. The one about the iron mines. The B grade's still visible in faded red ink at the top. He doesn't show it to anyone. Doesn't explain why he keeps it. But before every show, he touches it once. A reminder. Life's too short to pretend to be someone else. Even when you're Bob Dylan. Especially when you're Bob Dylan. The guitar hangs silent. The story remains. And somewhere, in the space between what we perform and who we are, the truth waits. Still terrible sometimes. Still honest. Still worth writing.